Imagine a courtroom filled with tension, all eyes fixed on a lone figure standing tall despite the weight of doubt pressing down upon her shoulders. This is where our story begins, but it's far from where it ends. Sarah Collins' tale is one of resilience in the face of humiliation, of unwavering determination when all seems lost, and of the extraordinary power of second chances. Before we continue, leave a comment below telling me where you're watching this video from. I'd love to know. As we delve into Sarah's world, you'll witness the crushing lows that threaten to extinguish her dreams and the soaring highs that redefine her destiny. You'll feel the sting of defeat, the warmth of unexpected kindness, and the exhilaration of triumph against all odds. But more than that, you'll discover how one person's journey can illuminate the path for countless others, proving that our darkest moments can become the catalyst for our greatest achievements. Prepare to be captivated by a narrative that weaves together the raw emotion of personal struggle with the inspiring potential of the human spirit. Sarah's story is not just a recounting of events. It's a testament to the power of perseverance, the importance of community, and the profound impact of believing in oneself when no one else does. So settle in, open your heart, and prepare to be transported into a world where justice, compassion, and determination collide. The story of Sarah Collins is about to unfold, and trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment of this remarkable journey. In the heart of Ohio, nestled among rolling hills and sprawling farmlands, lay the small town of Millbrook. It was here, under a canopy of maple trees and amidst the echoes of church bells, that Sarah Collins first dared to dream beyond the horizons that seemed to hem in so many of her peers. From a young age, Sarah's piercing blue eyes held a spark of determination that set her apart, a fire that burned with the desire to make a difference in the world. Sarah's childhood home, a modest two-story house with peeling white paint and a creaky porch swing, was filled with the warmth of love but often echoed with the whispers of financial worries. Her father, a factory worker with calloused hands and a gentle smile, and her mother, a part-time librarian who nurtured Sarah's love for books, struggled to make ends meet. Yet, it was within these walls that Sarah's dream of becoming a lawyer first took root. As a child, Sarah would often sit cross-legged on the living room floor, engrossed in courtroom dramas on their old television set. While other children her age dreamed of becoming astronauts or pop stars, Sarah imagined herself standing before a judge, her voice strong and clear as she fought for justice. Her parents, recognizing the intensity of her passion, encouraged her dreams even as they privately worried about the seemingly insurmountable obstacles that lay ahead. Throughout her school years, Sarah's determination only grew stronger. She threw herself into her studies with a fervor that both impressed and concerned her teachers. Late nights hunched over textbooks, weekends spent volunteering at the local legal aid office, and summers working multiple jobs to save for college became her norm. Sarah's relentless pursuit of her goal often left her isolated from her peers, who couldn't understand her drive or her dreams of a life beyond Millbrook. As high school graduation approached, Sarah's hard work paid off. She was accepted into a prestigious university with a partial scholarship, a moment of triumph tinged with the bittersweet realization of the financial burden that still loomed. The night before she left for college, Sarah sat on the porch swing with her parents, the weight of their expectations and their pride hanging in the air between them. "You're going to change the world, sweetheart," her father said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just don't forget where you came from." Sarah nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. "I won't, Dad. I promise." The journey to becoming a lawyer was even more challenging than Sarah had anticipated. The rigors of undergraduate studies pushed her to her limits, forcing her to dig deeper than she ever had before. She juggled a full course load with part-time jobs, often surviving on vending machine snacks and stolen naps in the library. The glossy brochures of law schools seemed like distant dreams, always just out of reach. But Sarah Collins was not one to give up easily. With each obstacle, her resolve only strengthened. She formed study groups, sought out mentors, and took on internships that gave her a taste of the legal world she so desperately wanted to join. Her classmates often marveled at her stamina and focus, unaware of the nights she cried herself to sleep, overwhelmed by the pressure and the fear of failure. As her undergraduate years drew to a close, Sarah faced the daunting task of applying to law schools. She poured her heart and soul into her applications, her personal statements a testament to her journey and her unwavering commitment to justice. The waiting period was excruciating, each day a roller coaster of hope and despair. Finally, on a crisp spring morning, an email arrived that would change everything. Sarah had been accepted into law school, with a scholarship that would make her dream financially possible. As she read the acceptance letter, her hands shaking and tears streaming down her face, Sarah felt a surge of validation for all the sacrifices she had made. The call home to her parents was emotional, filled with joyful sobs and words of pride. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, she allowed herself a moment of pure, unadulterated happiness. She had done it. She was on her way to becoming a lawyer. Little did Sarah know that this moment of triumph was just the beginning of a journey that would test her in ways she could never have imagined. The path ahead would be filled with unexpected twists, crushing setbacks, and moments of despair that would shake her to her very core. But it would also lead her to discover strengths she didn't know she possessed, forge friendships that would last a lifetime, and ultimately find her true calling in a way she never expected. As Sarah drifted off to sleep that night, her dreams filled with images of courtrooms and justice, the universe was already setting in motion the events that would shape her destiny. The small-town girl from Ohio was about to embark on an adventure that would not only change her life, but touch the lives of countless others along the way. The hallowed halls of law school loomed before Sarah Collins like an imposing fortress, its Gothic architecture a stark contrast to the simple buildings of her hometown. As she stood at the entrance, her second-hand suitcase clutched tightly in her hand, Sarah felt a potent mix of excitement and terror coursing through her veins. This was it, the moment she had been working towards for years. Yet, as she watched her fellow students arrive in sleek cars and designer clothes, a flicker of doubt crept into her heart. From the very first day, it became clear that law school was going to push Sarah to her absolute limits. The workload was staggering, the competition fierce, and the pressure relentless. Sarah found herself in a world where every student seemed to be vying for the top spot, where friendships were often overshadowed by rivalry, and where the pursuit of justice sometimes seemed secondary to the pursuit of prestige. Despite the scholarship that had made her attendance possible, Sarah still struggled financially. While her classmates spent their evenings at upscale bars discussing case law over cocktails, Sarah worked late nights as a barista, her textbooks propped open behind the counter during lulls in customers. The disparity between her circumstances and those of her peers was a constant, gnawing presence in the back of her mind. But Sarah was nothing if not resilient. She threw herself into her studies with a fervor that both impressed and concerned her professors. Late nights in the library became her norm, her desk a fortress built of legal tomes and empty coffee cups. She formed study groups with other scholarship students, finding solace and strength in their shared struggles and aspirations. As the semesters progressed, Sarah's hard work began to pay off. Her sharp mind and meticulous attention to detail earned her top marks in her classes. Professors began to take notice of the quiet, determined girl from Ohio who could dissect complex legal arguments with remarkable clarity. Sarah even caught the eye of a prominent constitutional law professor who became a mentor and a guiding light during her darkest moments of self-doubt. But law school wasn't just about academic achievement for Sarah. It was here that she truly began to understand the power of the law to change lives. An internship at a local legal aid clinic opened her eyes to the struggles of those who couldn't afford proper legal representation. Sarah found herself working tirelessly on cases involving tenant rights, domestic violence, and immigration issues. Each small victory for her clients fueled her passion and reminded her why she had embarked on this journey in the first place. It was during one of these internships that Sarah encountered a case that would leave an indelible mark on her soul. She was assigned to assist on the case of Maria, a young immigrant mother fighting to regain custody of her children after fleeing an abusive relationship. The complexity of the case, involving both family law and immigration issues, was daunting. But it was the raw emotion of Maria's story, her courage, her desperation, her unwavering love for her children, that touched Sarah deeply. For weeks, Sarah poured every ounce of her energy into Maria's case. She spent countless hours researching precedents, preparing documents, and strategizing with the lead attorney. The night before the crucial hearing, Sarah stayed up until dawn, meticulously reviewing every detail of their argument. The courtroom was tense as Maria's case was presented. Sarah sat beside the lead attorney, her heart pounding as she watched the proceedings unfold. When it came time for Maria to testify, Sarah felt a surge of protectiveness for this woman she had come to admire so deeply. As Maria recounted her story, her voice trembling but determined, Sarah saw the judge's expression soften almost imperceptibly. In the end, their efforts paid off. The judge ruled in Maria's favor, granting her custody and setting her on a path towards legal residency. The moment the decision was announced, Maria turned to Sarah with tears streaming down her face and embraced her tightly. In that embrace, Sarah felt the true weight and significance of what it meant to be a lawyer, to be a voice for those who might otherwise go unheard. This experience solidified Sarah's commitment to using her legal education to make a real difference in people's lives. It also taught her valuable lessons about the importance of empathy, perseverance, and thinking creatively within the bounds of the law. These were lessons that would serve her well in the challenges that lay ahead. As her final year of law school approached, Sarah faced the daunting task of securing a position after graduation. The pressure to land a high-paying job at a prestigious firm was intense, with many of her classmates vying for a limited number of coveted positions. Sarah, however, found herself torn. The allure of financial security was tempting, especially given her background, but her heart pulled her towards public interest law. After much soul-searching and long conversations with her mentor, Sarah made the decision to pursue a career in public defense. It wasn't the most lucrative path, nor the most glamorous, but it aligned perfectly with her values and her desire to make a tangible difference in people's lives. The day of graduation arrived, filled with a bittersweet mix of pride, excitement, and trepidation about the future. As Sarah donned her cap and gown, she thought back to the young girl from Millbrook who had dared to dream of this moment. She had made it this far, against all odds. Little did she know that the greatest challenges and the most profound triumphs of her journey were yet to come. As she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, Sarah Collins stood tall, her blue eyes shining with determination. She was no longer just a small-town girl with big dreams. She was a lawyer, ready to face whatever the future held, armed with knowledge, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of the courthouse as Sarah Collins ascended them, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Today marked her first major case as a public defender, a moment she had been preparing for since she first set foot in law school. The weight of responsibility pressed down upon her shoulders, but Sarah stood tall, her chin held high as she entered the imposing building. The case seemed straightforward enough on paper, a young man accused of petty theft, caught in a moment of desperation. But as Sarah had delved deeper into her client's story, she uncovered a web of circumstances that painted a far more complex picture. This wasn't just about a stolen item. It was about a broken system, lack of opportunities, and a young life hanging in the balance. As she made her way to the courtroom, Sarah couldn't help but feel a flutter of nerves in her stomach. This was her chance to put into practice everything she had learned, to be the voice for someone who desperately needed to be heard. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The courtroom was already buzzing with activity. Sarah's eyes were immediately drawn to the opposing counsel, a seasoned prosecutor known for his ruthless tactics and impressive win record. Jonathan Blackwell was a man whose reputation preceded him, his sharp suits and sharper wit having become legendary in legal circles. As their eyes met across the room, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine at the predatory gleam in Blackwell's gaze. The case proceeded, and initially, Sarah held her own. Her opening statement was passionate and articulate, laying out the circumstances that had led her client to his desperate act. She presented evidence of his attempts to find employment, his struggle with an ailing mother, and his genuine remorse for his actions. For a moment, it seemed as though the jury was truly listening, their expressions softening as they considered the human story behind the charges. But as the trial progressed, things began to unravel. Blackwell's cross-examination was brutal, picking apart Sarah's arguments with surgical precision. He painted her client as a habitual offender, exploiting a minor detail in his background that Sarah had overlooked. With each passing moment, Sarah felt her carefully constructed case crumbling around her. Panic began to set in as Sarah realized she was out of her depth. She fumbled with her notes, her usually sharp mind clouded by stress and self-doubt. The judge's impatient sighs and the jury's waning attention only added to her growing sense of dread. The final blow came during closing arguments. Blackwell, sensing victory, delivered a scathing indictment not just of Sarah's client, but of her abilities as a lawyer. His words were like daggers, each one finding its mark with unerring accuracy. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Blackwell intoned, his voice dripping with condescension, "what we've witnessed here today is not just the failure of a young man to take responsibility for his actions, but the failure of his counsel to provide adequate representation. Ms. Collins, in her naivety and inexperience, has done her client a great disservice. Her emotional pleas and half-baked arguments have no place in this court of law. I implore you to see through this amateurish display and deliver the justice that our community deserves." Sarah sat frozen, each word a blow to her confidence and her dreams. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom upon her, the judge's disappointment, the jury's dismissal, and worst of all, the look of betrayal in her client's eyes. In that moment, Sarah Collins, who had fought so hard to prove herself worthy of her place in this world of law, felt smaller than she ever had before. The verdict, when it came, was a foregone conclusion. Guilty on all charges, with a sentence that seemed to mock everything Sarah had tried to argue for. As the gavel fell with a finalizing thud, Sarah felt as though her entire world had shattered. The aftermath of the trial was a blur of humiliation and regret. Sarah stumbled out of the courthouse, barely registering the pitying glances of her colleagues or the triumphant smirk on Blackwell's face. She made it as far as her car before the tears came, hot and relentless, streaking down her face as she sobbed into the steering wheel. In the days that followed, Sarah's defeat played out in painfully public ways. Local legal blogs dissected her performance, with some particularly cruel commentators suggesting she should consider a different career path. Even her own office seemed to treat her differently, the assignments that came her way becoming increasingly mundane and low profile. It was as if overnight, all the promise and potential everyone had seen in her had evaporated, replaced by doubt and disappointment. The weight of her failure pressed down on Sarah, coloring every aspect of her life. She found herself avoiding social gatherings, unable to face the pitying looks and awkward silences that seemed to follow her everywhere. Nights became a torment of replaying the trial in her mind, imagining all the things she could have done differently, all the arguments she should have made. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and filled with dreams of courtroom humiliations. Sarah's confidence, once her greatest asset, was now in tatters. She second-guessed every decision, every argument, every word she wrote or spoke. The passion that had driven her through years of struggle and sacrifice now felt like a naive dream, mocking her with its memory. She began to wonder if perhaps her critics were right. Maybe she wasn't cut out for this after all. The final straw came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Sarah was hunched over her desk, half-heartedly reviewing documents for a minor case, when she overheard two of her colleagues talking in hushed tones just outside her cubicle. "Poor Sarah," one voice said, dripping with false sympathy. "I heard Blackwell's using her as an example in his lectures now. How not to present a case, he calls it." The other voice chuckled. "Well, can you blame him? It was a masterclass in incompetence. I give her another month before she packs it in and heads back to whatever small town she came from." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She sat there, frozen, as her colleagues moved away, unaware of the damage their casual cruelty had inflicted. In that moment, something inside Sarah broke. The last vestiges of her self-belief crumbled away, leaving behind a hollow ache of despair. That evening, Sarah didn't go home. Instead, she found herself wandering the streets of the city, the rain soaking through her coat, matching the tears that streamed down her face. She ended up at a small park, sitting on a wet bench as the night deepened around her. As she stared into the darkness, Sarah Collins made a decision that would change the course of her life. She would leave the city, leave her job, leave behind the broken pieces of her dream. In the morning, she would tender her resignation and book a ticket back to Millbrook, back to the safety of her parents' home, where she could lick her wounds and try to figure out what to do with the shattered remains of her ambitions. As Sarah finally made her way home that night, she felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. Grief for the death of a dream she had nurtured for so long, and relief at the thought of escaping the daily reminders of her failure. She fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, her mind already racing ahead to the logistics of dismantling the life she had built. Little did Sarah know that fate had other plans for her. The journey that had brought her to this low point was far from over. In fact, it was about to take a turn that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself, about justice, and about the true meaning of success. The Sarah Collins who would emerge from this crucible of failure and self-doubt would be a very different woman from the one who had entered that fateful courtroom. As the city slept around her, the wheels of destiny were already in motion, setting the stage for a comeback story that would inspire not just Sarah, but countless others who had ever faced defeat and despair. The old bus creaked and groaned as it wound its way through the familiar landscape of rural Ohio. Sarah Collins sat near the back, her forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window, watching as the sprawling cityscape gave way to rolling fields and small towns. Each mile that passed brought a complex mix of emotions: relief, regret, shame, and a tiny flicker of hope that she couldn't quite extinguish. As the "Welcome to Millbrook" sign came into view, Sarah felt her heart constrict. This place, once too small to contain her dreams, now loomed large as both a refuge and a reminder of her failure. The bus lurched to a stop in the town square, and Sarah stepped out into the warm summer air, the weight of her single suitcase nothing compared to the burden of disappointment she carried. Her parents were waiting for her, their faces a mixture of concern and love. Her mother's embrace was fierce and protective, while her father's hand on her shoulder conveyed a silent understanding. No words were needed. They had heard the tremble in her voice during late-night phone calls, had read between the lines of her vague explanations. They knew their daughter was hurting, and for now, that was all that mattered. The first few days back in Millbrook passed in a haze of sleep and silence. Sarah spent most of her time in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by reminders of the ambitious girl she had once been. Trophies from debate competitions gathered dust on shelves, while framed certificates and newspaper clippings chronicling her academic achievements seemed to mock her from the walls. She thought about taking them down but couldn't bring herself to do it. It felt too much like admitting defeat. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Sarah began to emerge from her cocoon of misery. It started with small things: helping her mother tend to the garden, accompanying her father on his morning walks. The simple rhythms of small-town life began to soothe her frayed nerves, the familiar faces and places a balm to her wounded spirit. One morning, about 2 weeks after her return, Sarah found herself walking past the Millbrook courthouse. It was a modest building, nothing like the imposing structures she had become accustomed to in the city, but it held a quiet dignity. Almost without realizing it, Sarah found herself climbing the steps and pushing open the heavy wooden doors. The interior was cool and quiet, the hushed atmosphere broken only by the soft shuffling of papers and muted conversations. Sarah wandered the hallways, her fingertips trailing along the worn wooden banisters. She found herself in front of a bulletin board covered with notices, community announcements, legal aid information, and a flyer that caught her eye. Volunteers needed, Courthouse Assistance Program. Sarah stood there, staring at the flyer, feeling something stir within her. It wasn't the burning ambition of her youth or the desperate need to prove herself that had driven her in law school. This was something quieter, more grounded, a simple desire to be useful, to help in whatever small way she could. Before she could talk herself out of it, Sarah jotted down the contact information. Later that day, she made a call and signed up for the volunteer program. It wasn't much, just a few hours a week helping people navigate the complexities of legal paperwork, but it was a start. The first day of volunteering was nerve-wracking. Sarah's hands shook as she arranged and rearranged the informational pamphlets on her desk. But as people began to come in, seeking help with everything from small claims forms to custody agreements, Sarah found herself slipping into a familiar rhythm. The legal knowledge she had worked so hard to acquire hadn't disappeared. It was still there, waiting to be used. What surprised Sarah most was how different this felt from her high-pressure days in the city. Here, there were no opposing counsel trying to trip her up, no judges impatiently drumming their fingers. It was just Sarah and the people who needed her help, working together to navigate the often confusing world of legal procedures. As the weeks passed, Sarah's reputation in the volunteer program grew. People began to specifically ask for her, appreciating her patience, her clear explanations, and her genuine desire to help. She found herself looking forward to her shifts at the courthouse, feeling a sense of purpose that had been missing since her disastrous trial. It was during one of these shifts that Sarah encountered Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, an elderly woman struggling with an eviction notice. As Sarah helped her fill out the necessary forms, Mrs. Thompson began to share her story. She had lived in her apartment for over 40 years, but the building had recently been bought by a large development company that was trying to force out long-term tenants to convert the units into luxury condos. Sarah listened, feeling a familiar spark of indignation at the injustice of the situation. Before she knew it, she was diving deeper into Mrs. Thompson's case, researching tenant rights and local housing laws long after her volunteer shift had ended. She compiled a folder of information and resources, even reaching out to a local tenants' rights organization on Mrs. Thompson's behalf. A week later, Mrs. Thompson returned to the courthouse, her face beaming. With the information and support Sarah had provided, she had been able to successfully challenge the eviction notice. As the elderly woman enveloped Sarah in a tight hug, tears of gratitude in her eyes, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The joy of this small victory, the knowledge that she had made a real difference in someone's life, filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. Word of Sarah's work with Mrs. Thompson spread quickly in the small town. Soon other residents facing similar issues began to seek her out. Sarah found herself spending more and more time at the courthouse, her volunteer hours extending well beyond her official shifts. She was no longer just helping with paperwork. She was providing real legal guidance, drawing on her education and experience to help people navigate complex situations. One afternoon, as Sarah was poring over a particularly tricky case involving a local family's dispute with their insurance company, she felt a presence behind her. Looking up, she found herself face to face with Judge Miller, a stern-faced woman in her 60s who had presided over the Millbrook Courthouse for nearly 2 decades. "Ms. Collins," Judge Miller said, her tone impossible to read, "I've been hearing a lot about you. Would you join me in my chambers for a moment?" Sarah followed the judge, her heart pounding. Had she overstepped her bounds as a volunteer? Was she in trouble for providing more extensive legal advice than her position allowed? As she settled into a chair across from Judge Miller's imposing desk, Sarah braced herself for a reprimand. Judge Miller's chambers were a stark contrast to the bustling energy of the courthouse. The room was quiet, with walls lined with leather-bound law books, and the air heavy with the scent of old paper and polished wood. Sarah perched on the edge of her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she waited for the judge to speak. Judge Miller studied Sarah for a long moment, her piercing gaze seeming to look right through her. When she finally spoke, her words were not at all what Sarah had been expecting. "Miss Collins, I'm going to be frank with you," Judge Miller began, her tone serious but not unkind. "I've been watching your work here over the past few months. Your dedication, your attention to detail, and most importantly, your genuine desire to help people. It's impressive. It reminds me of myself when I was your age." Sarah blinked in surprise, unsure how to respond to this unexpected praise. Judge Miller continued, a hint of a smile softening her features. "I have a proposition for you, Ms. Collins. As you may know, I've been on the bench here in Millbrook for almost 20 years. What you may not know is that I've recently been diagnosed with a health condition that requires me to take an extended leave of absence." Sarah's mind raced, trying to understand where this conversation was heading. Judge Miller leaned forward, her eyes locked on Sarah's. "I need someone to step in as a temporary judge for a series of small civil cases while I'm away. Someone who knows the law, who understands our community, and who has the compassion and integrity to make fair decisions. I believe that someone could be you." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her? A judge? The very idea seemed absurd. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain all the reasons why she was completely unqualified for such a position, but Judge Miller held up a hand to stop her. "Before you say anything, hear me out. I know about what happened in the city. News travels fast in legal circles, even out here. But I also know that one failure doesn't define a person. What defines us is how we choose to move forward. And from what I've seen, you've chosen to move forward by dedicating yourself to helping others, by using your knowledge and skills to make a real difference in people's lives. That's what being a judge is all about." Sarah sat in stunned silence, her mind whirling with a mix of fear, disbelief, and a tiny spark of excitement that she couldn't quite suppress. Judge Miller's words had struck a chord deep within her, awakening something that she thought had died in that city courtroom. I don't know what to say," Sarah finally managed to stammer out. "I'm honored that you would even consider me, but are you sure? After everything that happened?" Judge Miller's expression softened further. "Ms. Collins, we all face setbacks in our careers. What matters is not that we fall, but that we get back up. You've already shown incredible resilience and growth. This opportunity could be a chance for you to not only prove to others but to yourself what you're truly capable of." As the reality of what Judge Miller was offering began to sink in, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions wash over her. Fear, certainly. The thought of taking on such a responsibility was terrifying. But there was also a growing sense of excitement, a feeling that this could be the second chance she never thought she'd get. I don't know if I'm ready for this," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Judge Miller nodded understandingly. "That's a normal feeling. But let me ask you this. Were you ready when you first stepped into a courtroom as an attorney? Were you ready when you took on your first case? We're never truly ready for the big moments in our lives, Ms. Collins. We just have to have the courage to take them on anyway." Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind racing with the possibilities. Could she do this? Could she really step into the role of a judge, even temporarily? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I'll need some time to think about this," Sarah said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Judge Miller smiled. "Of course. Take a few days to consider it. But don't let fear hold you back, Ms. Collins. Sometimes the opportunities that scare us the most are the ones that have the power to change our lives for the better." As Sarah left the judge's chambers, her head spinning with the weight of the decision before her, she couldn't help but feel that she was standing on the precipice of something monumental. This wasn't just about a temporary position or a chance to redeem herself professionally. This was an opportunity to redefine who she was, to prove to herself and to the world that her passion for justice was more than just youthful idealism. The next few days were a blur of introspection and soul-searching for Sarah. She spent long hours walking the quiet streets of Millbrook, weighing the pros and cons, imagining herself in the role of a judge. She sought advice from her parents, who listened with a mixture of pride and concern, offering support but ultimately telling her that this was a decision she had to make for herself. On the third day, as the sun was setting over the Ohio countryside, Sarah found herself once again standing in front of the Millbrook courthouse. She looked up at the building, no longer seeing it as a simple small-town institution, but as a place where real justice could be served, where lives could be changed, and where she might find her true calling. In that moment, Sarah Collins made a decision that would alter the course of her life and the lives of many others in ways she couldn't yet imagine. She would accept Judge Miller's offer. She would step into the role of temporary judge, facing her fears and embracing the challenge head-on. As she walked home that evening, her step lighter and her heart filled with a mixture of trepidation and determination, Sarah had no way of knowing that her decision would set in motion a series of events that would not only redefine her own future, but also change the face of justice in Millbrook and beyond. The Sarah Collins who had arrived in Millbrook broken and defeated was gone. In her place stood a woman ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with hard-won wisdom, a deepened sense of empathy, and an unwavering commitment to justice. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. Whatever came next, She was ready to face it. The journey ahead would be difficult, but she was no longer afraid. She was Sarah Collins, and she was ready to become the judge that Millbrook needed, and in the process, perhaps to discover the strength and wisdom she had possessed all along. The news of Sarah's appointment as temporary judge spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Reactions were mixed. Some welcomed the fresh perspective she would bring, while others questioned her experience and qualifications. Sarah felt the weight of their scrutiny, but she was determined to prove herself worthy of Judge Miller's trust. Her first day on the bench was a whirlwind of emotions. As she donned the black robe, Sarah caught her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized herself. Gone was the defeated young lawyer who had fled the city in disgrace. In her place stood a woman with purpose, her chin held high and her eyes clear with determination. The cases that came before her in those first few weeks were relatively straightforward. Small claims disputes, minor civil disagreements, nothing that would make headlines. But for Sarah, each case was an opportunity to demonstrate her commitment to fairness and justice. She listened carefully to each argument, asked probing questions, and delivered judgments that were both compassionate and firmly rooted in the law. Word began to spread about the new judge in Millbrook. People talked about her patience, her ability to explain complex legal concepts in simple terms, and her genuine desire to find equitable solutions. Slowly but surely, the skepticism that had greeted her appointment began to give way to respect and admiration. But Sarah's true test came on a crisp autumn morning, when a case landed on her docket that would challenge everything she had learned about the law and about herself. The plaintiff was a local environmental group, suing a large corporation for polluting the town's river. The defendant was represented by none other than Jonathan Blackwell, the very same attorney who had humiliated Sarah in her last trial in the city. As Blackwell strutted into the courtroom, his eyes widened in recognition and then narrowed with disdain. Sarah felt a flutter of panic in her chest, memories of her previous defeat threatening to overwhelm her. But as she gripped the edges of the bench, she took a deep breath and steeled herself. This was her courtroom now, and she was no longer the inexperienced lawyer he had once bested. The trial that unfolded over the next few days was a masterclass in legal maneuvering. Blackwell brought all of his considerable skills to bear, weaving a complex argument designed to absolve his client of any wrongdoing. But Sarah was no longer the easy target he remembered. She listened carefully, asked incisive questions, and refused to be intimidated by Blackwell's aggressive tactics. As the trial progressed, Sarah found herself drawing on everything she had learned, not just in law school, but in her time volunteering at the courthouse and in the weeks she had spent on the bench. She saw through Blackwell's attempts to obfuscate the facts and recognized the human story at the heart of the case, a community fighting to protect its natural resources against a corporation that prioritized profits over environmental stewardship. When it came time to deliver her verdict, Sarah took a moment to look out over the packed courtroom. She saw the faces of her neighbors, the people who had given her a second chance. And in that moment, she knew exactly what she had to do. Her ruling was a masterpiece of legal reasoning, carefully balancing the letter of the law with the principles of justice and community welfare. She found in favor of the environmental group, ordering the corporation to not only cease its polluting activities, but also to fund a comprehensive cleanup of the river and to establish a trust for ongoing environmental monitoring. The courtroom erupted in cheers as Sarah delivered her decision. Blackwell's face was a mask of shock and grudging respect. As the gavel fell, Sarah felt a surge of emotion, not triumph over her old adversary, but a deep sense of satisfaction that she had been able to use her position to make a real difference in her community. In the days that followed, Sarah's ruling made headlines far beyond Millbrook. Legal scholars praised her innovative approach. Environmental activists hailed her as a champion of conservation, and the people of Millbrook looked at her with newfound admiration and gratitude. As her temporary appointment drew to a close, Sarah received an unexpected visit from Judge Miller, now recovered and ready to return to the bench. The older woman embraced Sarah warmly, tears in her eyes. "You've done more than I ever could have hoped," Judge Miller said, her voice thick with emotion. "You haven't just filled my seat. You've elevated it. You've shown this town, and yourself, what true justice looks like." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you for believing in me," she said softly, "for giving me this chance." Judge Miller smiled. "The chance was always there, Sarah. You just needed to believe in yourself enough to take it." As Sarah prepared to step down from her temporary position, she was flooded with job offers from law firms and judicial appointments from neighboring counties. But as she considered her options, she realized that her heart belonged to Millbrook. This small town that had embraced her, supported her, and given her the opportunity to rediscover her passion for justice was where she belonged. In the end, Sarah decided to open her own small practice in Millbrook, focusing on environmental law and community advocacy. She also continued to volunteer at the courthouse, mentoring young lawyers and helping to ensure that justice remained accessible to all. Years passed, and Sarah Collins became a pillar of the Millbrook community. Her reputation as a fair and compassionate advocate for justice spread far and wide. Young lawyers sought her out for guidance, judges consulted her on complex cases, and her former nemesis, Jonathan Blackwell, even reached out to collaborate on a pro bono project. But for Sarah, the greatest reward was the knowledge that she had found her true calling. Every day, as she walked up the steps of the Millbrook courthouse, she was filled with a sense of purpose and gratitude. She had faced her darkest moment, confronted her deepest fears, and emerged stronger and wiser for the experience. Sarah Collins had set out to change the world through the law, and in her own way she had succeeded. Not through grand gestures or high-profile cases, but through the everyday work of bringing justice and compassion to her community. She had learned that true success wasn't measured in courtroom victories or prestigious appointments, but in the lives touched and the positive changes made, no matter how small. As she stood in front of the courthouse one crisp autumn morning, much like the day she had first volunteered there, Sarah smiled to herself. Her journey had been long and often difficult, filled with unexpected twists and turns. But every step, every triumph and setback, had led her to exactly where she was meant to be. Sarah Collins, once a small-town girl with big dreams, had become a beacon of justice in her community. And in doing so, she had not only found her place in the world, but had also inspired countless others to believe in the power of second chances and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The story of Sarah Collins, from ambitious law student to disgraced attorney to respected judge and community leader, would be told for years to come in Millbrook and beyond. It was a testament to the power of perseverance, the importance of community, and the transformative nature of justice when wielded with compassion and integrity. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its warm light over the town, Sarah took a deep breath and climbed the courthouse steps, ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring. For she knew now, with unshakable certainty, that this was where she belonged, not just in this town or this courthouse, but in the never-ending pursuit of justice, one case, one person, one day at a time. And so, the legacy of Sarah Collins continued to grow, a living testament to the power of resilience, the importance of second chances, and the enduring impact of a life dedicated to the service of others. Her story, once a cautionary tale of failure and defeat, had become an inspiration to all who heard it, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, hope and redemption are always within reach, if only we have the courage to reach out and grasp them.